Hi, everybody. So this is your second video for Unit 1, where we're going to look at some terrestrial biomes. And after this video, in the third video, that's when we'll be looking at some aquatic biomes. But for this one, we're just going to look specifically at biomes on land. So in general, a biome consists of all the plants and animals that are found in a particular region of the world. These plants and animals are determined by the climate of that biome. So the average temperature and the average precipitation. When we have warmer temperatures, more precipitation, we see more decomposition. So in general, more nutrients available so we can support larger plant life. Whereas in places like the tundra, when we look at this map to the right, or this diagram to the right, the tundra has low temperatures, low precipitation, so we don't see a lot of decomposition and we don't see a lot of plant life in this area. So terrestrial biomes are geographical regions of land. They're categorized again by the combination of average annual temperature and precipitation. And then they're really defined by the plant growth forms that are adapted to that climate. So in general, we use plants when we're thinking about terrestrial biomes because they don't move around, they're sedentary, whereas animals can move from one biome to another. They can move if their ranges kind of overlap into different biomes. But in general, the plants are what we actually use when classifying and categorizing these different biomes. So when we're looking at some terrestrial biomes, we are also going to be looking at climate diagrams. They're also called climatographs. The College Board will occasionally give you some climate graphs and ask you to identify what biome you're looking at. So we're going to start looking at these today and work on them more in class this week. But climatographs summarize the monthly measurements of temperature and precipitation. So it doesn't necessarily matter which axes you use for temperature and rainfall, but you will have two y-axes. In this graph here, this is our average rainfall on the left. On the right is our average temperature. In this climate graph, temperature is shown as a line graph. So this is our temperature. So when you're reading this graph, you would look at this line and then look over to the rightmost y-axis to see actual measurements. So if we're looking for a peak, it's around, my line kind of bumped down, oops, but it's around 29, 30, something like that. So then with average rainfall, in this graph, it's shown using a bar graph, and that's probably how we'll draw them in class. But I'm going to scroll over for a second. Climatographs can also just be line graphs. So that's why it's really important that you're identifying which axis you need to be looking at and which line or which color represents temperature versus precipitation. So in this one, it's pretty easy because our bar graph is representing rainfall. So you would just be going over to your leftmost y-axis to look at how many millimeters of rainfall you saw in each month. So we're going to look at 9 different biomes, and these are biomes that are specifically called out by the College Board as things that they want you to be familiar with. There are more biomes, but they're kind of more specific if you're looking really specifically at a certain area. So we're just going to look at these 9 broader categories. The first one is the tundra. So the tundra is found kind of just below the ice caps. So it's across the top of North America, in very upper Europe, and Siberia in Asia. The tundra is classified by this thing called permafrost, which is a layer of soil that is permanently frozen. So that makes it impermeable. That means nothing can get through it. So water can't drain and roots cannot penetrate. So what that means for plants is you've got this kind of cement layer that they cannot get through. It's completely frozen. So we have no large trees in this biome. So we see only smaller kind of shrubby plants. Additionally, we see really low decomposition rates. So I'm gonna say low decomp rates. And that's because it's really cold. So when it's really cold, it's really hard for things to decompose. Generally, you need some heat to decompose things. So we get low decomposition rates, which means there's not many nutrients available in general for these plants to use to grow. Some major human impacts that we see in the tundra are we see global warming, which melts this permafrost. And we also see that this leads to higher rates of decomposition. So the tundra is kind of classified as a place that has permafrost and low decomposition rates. So when the globe is warming, we're seeing these things change pretty drastically. And then if we look at this climatograph, again, this is one where both temperature and rainfall or precipitation are represented as a line graph. So you just want to make sure that when you're looking at temperature, that's the red line, that you're looking over at this left y-axis. When you're looking at precipitation, you're looking over at the right. We see fairly low levels of precipitation, and we also see really low temperatures with lows of negative 15-ish degrees Celsius. Our next biome is taiga. This is also called the boreal forest. So you can use either name and College Board will know what you're talking about. But the taiga is located in southern Alaska, and most of Canada, Scandinavia, and Siberia have taigas. So the taiga is still really cold. It's a little bit warmer in the summer than the tundra is, and it still has really low levels of precipitation. And this nutrient poor soil, this again comes because we have really cold temperatures, meaning we have low decomposition. And decomposition is what returns nutrients that are found in living organisms to the soil. So when we have low rates of decomposition, we have nutrient poor soil. So that's another characteristic of the taiga biome. Some human impacts are, since this biome does not have permafrost, we get these large trees that can grow. So the image to the right shows these really large trees, and we humans have deforested these regions historically, overlogged them. Also in these areas is where we find a lot of oil and natural gas reserves. So we mine for coal and then extract oil and natural gas in these areas, which can have some really big impacts on the biome. It destroys a lot of habitats and it leaves behind a lot of waste, which can harm the animals and plants that live there. So that's our human impact that we're seeing here. Our next biome is the temperate rainforest. This is a coastal biome where we have pretty moderate temperatures. They're moderate because it's kind of buffered by being coastal, being close to the ocean. So we don't see really high highs and really low lows. And we also see a lot of precipitation. We get a lot of fog in these biomes as well. This is Northern California along the coast. So where we are is a bit of a different biome, which I'll talk about, but along the coast, when we have forested areas, this is our temperate rainforest. The biggest human impact of these areas is logging, also development, people wanting to live out here along the coast, taking trees out and developing human areas instead. This climatograph is still kind of similar to the other two. We see more precipitation. So if we're looking at this blue line, we've got more precipitation in the winter months. So October, November, December, January, we see more precipitation. And our temperatures, again, are not going below zero. So when you have temperatures that aren't dropping below zero, that means that you have a growing season. So growing season is when plants can grow. So when plants grow. And this is when you have temps higher or greater than 0 degrees Celsius. So when we have temps higher than 0, we have a growing season. So our temperate rainforest has a 12-month growing season, which is pretty cool. So this biome is the temperate seasonal forest. This is different than the other biomes we've looked at before because this has rather warm summers and pretty cold winters. This biome also has what are called deciduous trees. So the biomes we've looked at before primarily have plant life that is not deciduous. So that means they keep their leaves year round. Deciduous trees lose their leaves. So for example, in the boreal forest, we have lots of pine trees, trees that don't lose their needles. And they also have needles that are rather waxy, so when they do fall, it's also really difficult to decompose those needles. But in this biome, we have deciduous trees, so they lose their leaves. I'll add that, lose leaves. Um, and it's also warmer, so that leads to rapid decomposition. And rapid decomposition leads to having this really nutrient-rich soil, which is great, supports lots and lots of plant life. Humans really like this because that means this land is great for agriculture. So one of the human impacts of this temperate seasonal forest is that it is often converted to agricultural land because we have high productivity, which means lots of photosynthesis. Because we have warm temperatures, we have sunlight, we have nutrient-rich soil, so that supports a lot of plants to grow. Also in this area, since we do have these deciduous trees, those are also cut down, and clear cutting has been another way that humans have impacted this area. So this biome is our shrubland. It is also called woodland. It is also called chaparral. Chaparral is the term that's specific to North America. So this is us. Petaluma, a lot of Sonoma County is chaparral. And this means we get hot, dry summers and we get cold, rainy winters. So in the summer, you can see in our climatograph, this blue line is precipitation. So in the summer, it is really low. It's pretty much zero. So we get pretty much no precipitation in the summer, but we get much higher precipitation in kind of November, December, January, February into March. We also get higher temperatures. This is San Luis Obispo, so if you're looking at going to college there, you can look at your temperature, average temp and precipitation. But we see our temperature kind of hovers almost to 20 degrees Celsius in the summer. The summer conditions, because they are so hot and they are so dry, it really favors wildfires occurring. And a lot of our plant life is adapted to these wildfires. So when a wildfire does come through, that is a signal for a lot of plants to produce and release seeds, or if they've got their seeds stored, they'll release them. So our native plants are pretty resistant to wildfires on average. As we've seen, wildfires have been picking up within the last 10 years, but this is something that we're seeing currently in our area as well. So another thing about this biome is it has pretty low nutrient soil. So the soil is not nutrient rich. That's because even though we're warm enough to support some decomposition, we have really rainy winters, which cause nutrients to leach out of the soil. So leaching just basically means that nutrients are picked up by the water that precipitates, the water that rains from the sky, and they are carried with that water to other locations. So they're taken out of the soil, things like nitrogen, things like phosphorus, things like potassium are pulled out of the soil by this rainwater, and they run off into other, either into groundwater, they run off into lakes, to rivers, to oceans, other neighboring aquatic areas. So with human impacts, this is a pretty nice area to live. So we see a lot of human development. We also see more fires because we've got more human things that can cause fires, whether it's dropping something flammable or dropping something on fire out in nature, or you've got these above ground electrical lines that spark sometimes. Those can cause fires as well, which is what we've been seeing recently around here. Okay, so this biome is our temperate grassland. We get pretty cold, pretty harsh winters and pretty warm, dry summers. This is like the Great Plains of North America as an example of a temperate grassland. We see a really long growing season in this area, which is really cool. So that means we've got lots of plant life that can be supported. And we see rapid decomposition because it is rather warm in this biome. And that means we have lots of nutrients. So like the Great Plains, a lot of this biome, no matter where it is used for agriculture because it can support plants for a long period of time because of that long growing season. And it also has a lot of nutrients for those plants to take up. So primarily in the Great Plains, that's where we see a lot of wheat growth and a lot of cattle growth or cattle grazing land. This biome is probably one you're pretty familiar with. This is the tropical rainforest. This is a really warm, wet biome, and it's primarily located around the equator. What we see in this biome is really high productivity. So that means, oh, let me zoomed in. This means lots of plants doing lots, oops, doings, doing lots of photosynthesis. And in this biome, we also see really rapid decomposition because it's warm and it's wet, decomposes really quickly, those leaves dropping from plants and organisms that die in this environment. But even though we have really rapid decomposition, you would think that there'd be lots of nutrients in the soil, that the soil would be great. But unfortunately, the soil is not fertile, and that's because there are so many plants in this area that any nutrients released into that soil are immediately picked up by those other plants. So the soil is very infertile, which is not necessarily common sense to think of. So that's something that you should kind of focus on about the tropical rainforest. We also, this is our most biodiverse terrestrial biome. We have more biodiversity per hectare than any other terrestrial biome. So this is hugely, hugely diverse. And what we can see, you can see it pretty well in this picture, but in the tropical rainforest, you have several different levels that support different life. So for example, at the top, this is where we have the canopy, where the large trees shade trees underneath them. There are certain organisms that only live in this canopy. Then also underneath, we have the understory or the subcanopy, which is made up of successive layers of shorter trees. So we see as we go down, we get shorter and shorter trees. There are different organisms that are specifically adapted to living in these different areas. So that is one reason why this area is just so biodiverse. I'm also guessing you're pretty familiar with savannas. This is where you have warm temperatures and a wet summer and a dry winter. So this is different than some of the other biomes, and this is something to think about if you get a multiple choice question, for example, that shows you some different climate diagrams. When you're looking at the savanna, you'll see this peak of rainfall. So this blue line again is precipitation in the summer months. So if you see a climate diagram with a rainfall peak in the summer, that is going to be an indication you're looking at a savanna. This land is often used for agriculture, and it's also used for grazing different animals, not just animals that are natural living there like zebras, but it's used by farmers for cattle and other things to graze as well. All right, this is the last biome that we're going to call out specifically. The desert is a biome that is hot and dry. So if you're looking at a climate diagram, you're looking for sorry, look at me doing what I told you not to do. You're looking at no precipitation, basically, and you are looking at fairly hot temperatures. So higher temperatures, no precipitation. That would indicate that you are looking at a desert. Deserts are located at 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south latitude. So you've got rainforests right in the equator. 30 degrees north and south is where you see your deserts. So major human impacts in the deserts are these areas have low levels of water already. And so when humans develop around them, they use a lot of groundwater. They pump it out to use for their own homes, for other areas. And that can drain the groundwater that's necessary for the plants and animals that live there. So these plants and animals, like all the biomes, they're very specifically adapted to living here. Some things that plants have, for example, are they have really waxy surfaces, which means they can lose less water because that wax kind of holds in whatever water that they have. They also have much fewer pores or stomata. If you've heard that word before, stomata are pores in which plants perform gas exchange, so they can lose a lot of water from those pores. Desert plants have a lot less of them than other plants. And when precipitation does occur in the desert, plants are adapted to either grow really fast if those plants are there year round, or if they are perennial plants, they will really rapidly grow, reproduce, and die as soon as there's any precipitation in these areas. Now, as we're looking at these biomes, you can look at a map now and see where all these biomes are located on Earth, but these biomes have shifted over time. So when the climate changes, these biome boundaries change as well. So during ice ages, when it's really, really cold in general on Earth, we see things like the boreal forest and the tundra moving closer towards the equator than we see today. What we're seeing now is our climate is warming. So it's likely that we will see shifting biomes shifting further away from the equator. So one example is our boreal forests. As our permafrost melts in the tundra, that means that there's that layer that stops plants with deep roots from growing is no longer there. So things like pine trees, like aspen and spruce, can move upwards more north, and that biome can be converted from tundra into boreal forests or taiga. Also, in the lower latitudes, aspen and spruce specifically can't survive in areas that are too warm. So as the climate warms, as areas that are further towards the equator become warmer, those aspen and spruce will not be able to survive in those areas as well. So they'll die off, and we'll see kind of a shift in this range more north. So this graph here shows what that would look like. So we see, we see that this green area is kind of like the major part of this biome, and it will likely be shifting north up to right here if our climate continues to warm. And then the FRQ that you're going to be looking at today is to identify one characteristic of a biome and explain how that characteristic determines the community of organisms found there. So you're picking out one specific thing in a biome, could be permafrost, could be really high temperatures, anything like that. And you're explaining how that characteristic determines what living things, whether that be animals or plants, live in that biome.